Member, the question is that the amendment be disagreed to, and I call the member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm glad to make some remarks about these bills that implement commitments that Australia has made under the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, to say some things about what the RCEP is and what it isn't. We are a trading nation, and our trade relations are incredibly important to our own social and economic and environmental well-being, also to the way that we engage with the wider world. And this is a key agreement in relation to our engagement with the Indo-Pacific. As a trading nation, I sometimes feel that in the Parliament, and perhaps also in the wider public domain, our conversation around trade can be simplistic and can fail to engage with some of the details and the nuances of trade, and particularly with trade agreement making. And I reflect on the contribution that the member for Brand, the Shadow Minister for Trade, made earlier. It was an excellent overview, not just of this agreement, but of trade agreement making and some of the things that are caught up in that process and that are important for Australians to consider. This agreement is a plurilateral trade agreement. It's the world's largest in terms of the economic coverage. As the previous speaker, the member for Sturt, said, it picks up the 10 ASEAN nations. It is effectively an ASEAN-led plurilateral agreement, which is significant in itself. And in addition to picking up Australia, it covers China, Japan, the Republic of Korea and New Zealand. It is a shame that India isn't part of it, and from Australia's point of view, the inclusion of India would have been meaningful in expanding sort of access to markets. As I'll talk about a little bit later on, the reality of this agreement is it doesn't give us access to markets to any greater degree than we already have, because we have existing agreements, in some cases several agreements, with all of the countries that are covered by RCEP. It follows not too far on the heels of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, another plurilateral. Why are we seeing these plurilateral agreements? Well, we're seeing them follow on from a period in which Australia and other nations went pretty hard in trying to settle bilateral trade agreements, and I think to some degree saw the limitations in just having a somewhat messy and complex set of separate bilateral arrangements. Why did we have a period when we were going down that bilateral path? Well, that's because the multilateral system, the system that was put in place under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and through its successor, the World Trade Organisation, has really run out of steam. And the best indication of that is that the Doha round commenced in 2001 and hasn't completed yet, 20 years later. The WTO, unfortunately, as the sort of the multilateral architecture for international trade, has really lost its sting. There's been a significant deterioration in cooperative spirit, participation, and the practical effect of what should be an effective multilateral trading system. So we get to these plurilaterals. We've had the TPP. Now we have the RCEP. Australia should pursue those. Labor has always thought that multilateral system is the best system because it's the widest coverage. If you can't get that, then there's certainly some benefit in plurilateral arrangements like the RCEP. They're better than having a welter of bilateral trade and investment agreements. When we enter into them, in the interests of the Australian people, we should be looking to achieve trade and investment arrangements that are more fair, responsible and sustainable, as well as more free, to overcome barriers that affect Australian producers, both when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to non-tariff barriers. We should be seeking agreements that harmonise arrangements and avoid what's called the noodle bowl problem, and that's what I was hinting at when I describe a sort of welter of bilateral trade agreements. It's very difficult for business, particularly for small and medium enterprises, when they are trying to expand into a range of markets, and each of those markets is covered by a separate bilateral, and the kinds of things that they need to conform to in order to have the benefit of those trade agreements changes all the time, and it becomes difficult to manage and difficult to comply with. That's what is meant when trade analysts or experts refer to as the noodle bowl problem, and sometimes through plurilateral arrangements you can help clean that up. We should also be trying to get into agreements that draw nations together in genuine commitments to ensure that economic activity doesn't compromise our environment and doesn't compromise workers' rights and human rights. And I'll come back to that in terms of the RCEP, because certainly there's a big difference between the CPTPP in that regard and the RCEP. So the RCEP has value as a framework, as a mechanism for drawing the participant countries into closer collaboration, and particularly when it comes to integrating the Indo-Pacific economically. In terms of its actual pure economic benefits, they're not that great. The reality is that even when fully matured, the RCEP would only provide tariff-free access that is equivalent to 94% of what we currently have. So if we were to get rid of all the agreements that exist with the other 14 nations, if we just click our fingers and make them all disappear and rely on the RCEP, we would straight away be going down to 86% of the existing tariff-free coverage, and even fully matured, we'd only have 94% of the existing tariff-free coverage. That's just where the negotiations ended up. The economic value to Australia is apparently going to be in what's called value chain improvements, because some of the tariff arrangements between other countries, not between ourselves and the other 14 nations, but between those nations themselves, provide the potential for economic benefits to Australian producers that are contributing into what is a multinational productive chain. Those value chain improvements aren't hard to understand in concept, they are hard to quantify, and there was nothing to the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties that could be provided to really get down to the nitty-gritty of what those value chain improvements might be. And of course, as it currently stands, through our treaty-making process, we don't have any independent economic analysis. We should, but we don't. So it's very difficult to see what the precise benefit of agreements like the RCEP would be. The RCEP could fix, but doesn't fix the noodle bowl problem, and that's related to what I've just said. We can't go and get rid of the existing bilaterals, because it would actually put our producers in a worse position than they're currently in. So we need to keep all of those bilaterals, or most of those bilaterals, and some other arrangements, ASEAN-plus arrangements, for their tariff benefit. So unfortunately, the potential to use the RCEP to alleviate some of those noodle bowl problems can't exist. The Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry actually made an argument to the JSCOT that the RCEP would only be beneficial if Australia wouldn't now go and, in their words, start to clean out the agreements from underneath it. But as I say, that would have impacts in reducing the amount of tariff-free access that Australian companies currently have under those pre-existing agreements. And just to give you an example, like Australia actually has 5 separate trade and/or investment agreements with Malaysia afoot. So imagine if you're a company seeking to expand and to trade into Malaysia for the first time, which of the 5 would you be using? Unfortunately, RCEP doesn't include any commitments when it comes to nations' approach to environmental protection and workplace rights and human rights. The CPTPP did, RCEP didn't, because even though when negotiations commenced back in 2012, Australia put that on the table and pushed for that, the other nations, the nations in ASEAN in particular, were not interested in including that, and that's a shame. I mean, it is possible. There's mechanisms by which the RCEP can evolve, and Australia should continue to be using our diplomatic leverage and our trade leverage to push for those things to be included in time to come, because they are important. There's no ISDS in the RCEP, and that's welcome. Probably not because Australia is resistant to it. The present government's quite happy with ISDS. It was actually the case that other participant nations didn't want that. We've discussed in this place before at length the fact that ISDS, an international tribunal system, does potentially give companies rights to sue the Australian government in relation to our own public policy, and I don't understand why we ever give away our sovereignty in that respect. It does put us at risk. We saw that with Philip Morris and the plain packaging case. There is a question mark over some areas of the Australian economy, care service industries, aged care in particular, in relation to reforms that we might seek to make in future. Now, that was explored a lot by the JSCOT, and we were given reassurances that nothing in the RCEP would compromise Australia's ability to make those kind of rules. Unfortunately, however, in the section of the RCEP where Australia lodged particular reservations, we lodged a particular reservation in relation to childcare. So we lodged a specific reservation saying Australia will always maintain the ability to regulate with respect to childcare, notwithstanding anything in the RCEP. But there was no similar reservation for aged care. And understandably, that raises the question of why. I mean, why childcare and not aged care? There's nothing in the RCEP in terms of dispute resolution or remediation that really is any different to what's in the WTO, and I think that's something we should all reflect on. The member for Brand sort of talked about the way the government will say, oh, here's this new U-Butte trade agreement, tick, put it on the shelf. I mean, let's just remember all of our own recent experience of geo-economic coercion involving China. The government told us how good the free trade agreement was with China. This is a plurilateral agreement that includes China. How much has that bilateral agreement helped us in relation to some of the actions that have been taken in relation to Australian producers and trade over the last couple of years? And does anyone think that the RCEP is going to change that? If they do, they're not too bright. We did hear through the JSCOT inquiry a list of the same kind of concerns and shortcomings that really apply to our existing trade-making process, and the member for Brand, the Shadow Minister for Trade, talked about that, and I do encourage members of the community and members in this place, if they're interested, to go and look at Report 193. It's an unusual report in the work of the JSCOT because it's not a report on an international agreement, which is most of the diet of the JSCOT. It's a standalone report on the trade agreement making process itself. And as someone who's been fortunate to be a member of the JSCOT since I was elected in 2016, I think it was a really worthwhile exercise, and the report was delivered on a genuinely bipartisan basis, and it makes some key recommendations about how we can improve trade agreement making. The JSCOT itself was introduced in recognition that there was what was called at the time a democratic deficit when it comes to the way the Australian government enters into international agreements, because but for the JSCOT, there is literally no involvement of the Parliament in those agreements, other than when we get what we're now dealing with here, enabling legislation. But it puts the Parliament in a very difficult position when we're dealing with enabling legislation that has been committed to by the Executive in a trade agreement that's already been signed. That's why the JSCOT should, in my view, be enabled to have more to do with the making of these agreements than it currently does. The JSCOT only sees these agreements now once they've been signed. So the recommendations of that report 193, do include improved transparency, that the government publish negotiation aims and objectives in advance, that both the community and the Parliament gets to see that, that the JSCOT be briefed biannually, not just on agreements that are close to being settled, but those that are in process, that the government also looks to deliver greater stakeholder engagement through the use of non-disclosure agreements, so that there's midstream engagement, and of course that there's independent economic modelling. I'll just finish my remarks by thanking again especially the civil society participants in the treaty-making process in this case, and generally the labour movement, organisations like AFTINET and others. They make a huge difference. They do all that without any specific funding to do it. They do it in the best interests of Australia as a whole. They raise really important issues, and without what they do, we would end up with much lower quality agreements than we get. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.